Yeah, I think we can start. Yes, I leave the word to Simon with some housekeeping and introduction.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second episode in the Pivot Not Pause series. And as Katerina said, if you wouldn't mind just muting your microphones as we move through the first phase, and we will have time for questions at the end. And we'd be interested in some of those from you. And so it's Katerina and myself from Innovation Bubble, and it's Lauren and Francis from GeoCreative. So in the last kind of webinar, we kind of established that brands are kind of over laboring both on time and budget, really, in terms of brand change, progression, development. And it seems rather, from all of our experience, it seems rather overly complex and kind of not very cost effective. And from our joint experience when we work together, we've been able to do this in a much more timely and cost effective way. And we're talking weeks rather than kind of months. And having set the scene with that, I think in this episode, this is going to be quite interesting. So we're going to be talking about audiences. So whether they're customers, clients, for example, about the questions that often brands kind of have hard time tackling. And I'm just going to kind of repeat some of the questions that we get asked often is, why do customers say one thing and do another, which is a very common kind of question we get answered. Why do my prices and my sales kind of projects not kind of create the engagement I'd like? And there we will explore the fact that obviously from a pragmatic point of view, emotions and the psychology of kind of decision making overplay prices, and we'll explore that in about 20 minutes or so. And what role do the non-conscious processes play? We've established, so we know from Harvard, we know from the last 30 years of cognitive science that non-conscious kind of factors account for 90%, yeah, that's right, 90%, quite shocking really, of customer decisions. Okay, so these are hidden things that you kind of need to kind of do specialist work to try and kind of rattle out, kind of make visible, but they're really crucial. And that probably answers the questions that we get along the lines of, I'm not, we did stuff, I'm a bit underwhelmed with kind of what happened. It was okay. I can't quite understand why it wasn't more impactful, given the fact that we asked customers a few questions and we did a survey and we listened on social media. And that's the other point to this kind of discussion really, is the fact that data is useful, but unfortunately it's not always critical. And this is often misunderstood by brands. So data in itself only measures a pattern. And the problem is that that data pattern shifts quickly. So often brands, as we shall see, are working on old data, which is pretty fatal really in terms of what they do next. And the other thing is that data doesn't answer the why question. So data will give you a pattern about what's occurring, but it doesn't tell you why it's occurring. And it certainly won't tell you how to change that pattern. So we need to kind of use methods that understand the why, get to the bottom of that, lift those stones up and kind of work out both from an emotional and a non-conscious point of view, because that's where the money is in terms of how we engage customers and make them feel kind of right and emotionally connected to a brand. How do we do that? And that's kind of what we're going to explore really. So with myself and Katerina from the sort of the why angle and the kind of looking at the data from a psychology point of view, and then with Francis and Lauren thinking about how we might operationalize those insights. That's what we're going to try and cover in the kind of next 25 minutes really. And from a joint perspective, we've worked across nearly all sectors, and it's applicable to whether you're talking about health, retail, travel, business development, for example. So, those of you listening, if it doesn't make any difference what sector you're from, this stuff should be fairly useful for you. So on that note, let's have a look at audiences and what it means to kind of understand them. And I'll hand over to Lauren.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining either if you're new or joining again from last week. As Simon said, it sounds a little bit like a nursery rhyme, Simon said that we're going to start with looking at audience needs and how we respond to those emotions and how that really impacts the process of brand and brand change throughout what we have now sort of dubbed the new normal post-lockdown of COVID-19. So we'll chat through a little bit about what we mean by audience need states, how this will change brand direction, a little bit more about in terms of change. So just to kind of recap what we said last time, and it's no different really week on, week out, is that there is really no doubt that COVID-19 and the pandemic has caused a huge worldwide difficulty, from business closures, mass restructuring on huge levels, economic and financial uncertainty, and the sort of increased idea around fear-mongering. And for those of us who've been working within the brand space for the last 3 months, we've sort of been leveled with this sort of proverbial battleground, as I like to call it, whereby it's really happened over a really short period of time. This change that we've seen has happened only in the last 3 months. And that in brand life cycles is relatively short. What this means in terms of what happens next or the now is that we're going through this constant idea of disruptive change, and how we navigate that has become relatively difficult. And certainly when it comes to how we approach audiences on a sort of more meaningful way. If we think about a little bit, going back to go forward, consumer sentiment pre-lockdown was that we kind of all lived a little bit in the sort of level of convenience, a bit like the sort of ignorance is bliss. We could action or access things whenever, however, and whatever we wanted. There was no roadblocks in our way in terms of how we engage with businesses or brands alike. But this has fundamentally changed, obviously, because we've been sort of forced into this sort of slightly different way of living, and how we engage or interact with brands has therefore had to change. In terms of the messaging that we would tend to engage with pre-lockdown, it was very much a functional way of approaching consumers. You know, we had sort of sales messaging, whether it's offers or promotions. There was some messaging that was sort of focused our attentions to the immediacy or the reactive style messaging. Convenience, talking about how it can sort of infiltrate our everyday lives, or even thematic and seasonal. These were the sort of the ways in which we would normally tend to interact with brands pre-lockdown period.
And unfortunately, this was what Simon said in the beginning, that even didn't work very well pre-lockdown. And the reason why it didn't was because many brands are unaware of how the brain actually processes and engages information, and what makes it engaged and paying attention to something. And functional messaging, convenience messaging, product description messaging, etc., is mainly addressing just the rational part of the brain, which makes up, if we're lucky, just 10% of the brain. 90% of the brain is actually driven by our what we call, in a simple terms, the emotional part of the brain. A huge part, which is responding to, well, emotional messaging. It wants to understand how you as a brand make me feel, if you are serving my needs, if you are serving what is meaningful and valuable to me. And unfortunately, even pre-lockdown, many brands were not very aware of this. It became a little bit more dominant in the last few years, where brands have woken up to this. But it's a journey, and becomes ever more important now in these times. And we will talk about this more, about especially negative emotions.
So if we think about how brands have tended to respond to audience needs over the last couple of years, there's sort of 3 areas that we tend to sort of come across or come up against. The first is the never-ending story of big data. And like Simon said at the very beginning, data is only one piece of the puzzle. We tend if you work with media agencies or big agencies, they like to sift through patterns to extract information, to find trends, patterns, forecasts, any sign that they could effectively predict what the outcome could look like between engagement between consumer and brand. Now, again, that only gives us a certain piece of information. It's quite two-dimensional, because it's predictive versus what's actually happening. We also tend to think about historic data. Now, historic data is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because of the fact that it gives us an idea of what happened previously and how we can then action that to ensure that we use information that's happened before to action that as something that we can take forward. However, on the flip side, we don't interrogate historic data enough. And I think more importantly now, with what's happened over the last couple of months, is that historic data from 12 months ago is completely and utterly null and void in relation to what's happening right now, what will happen in the next few months, because our behavior as consumers has changed, our feelings towards brands has changed. Therefore, historic data has to be interrogated even more so. I think it's quite interesting. I mean, we worked with brands in the past whereby even in sort of normal, or what we like to classify now as normal periods of time and normal activation times, is that brands have had issues with historic data being relatively unreliable. We worked on a brand whereby they used historic data as their kind of core of everything that they did. And unfortunately, we found out quite early on that the historic data had not been tracked appropriately, but they still actioned all next steps based on ill-fitting data. And I think, therefore, what we have to be a bit more mindful of now, specifically as historic data becomes a little less important in the grand scheme of things when it comes to people's emotions and how they actually behave with us, is that we have to really learn to interrogate historic data a bit better. Another trend or another area that we tend to look through from a data-centric point of view is benchmarking. What is my competitor doing? How are people responding to it, and how can I leverage that information to my best effect? Again, that's going to be important still, but does it give you enough information to really say that you can understand the attributes of a customer and how they feel about something that you're putting out into the world? We like to sift through patterns. We're kind of creatures of habit when it comes to audience insights, in terms of brand and media. But again, is it really enough for us to understand a person behind the data? Potentially not. And I think that's why we have to start attributing this idea of where data meets the emotional needs to help build a better and more meaningful campaign or action to a customer.
And one other key point is what data is actually being collected. And unfortunately, many times it is very conscious data that clients are collecting. And Simon was very positive when he said that 90% of the time or 10% of the time we are rational creatures. We make conscious decisions, but unfortunately it can be even 95%. So many researchers, many psychologists, economists, etc., over the last few decades have done extensive research into this and what drives our decision making, what drives our behavior. And when we are saying 95% of purchasing decisions are subconscious, it basically means that customers are unaware of what drives their behavior. Decisions are made so quickly because we make so many of them per day that we actually cannot make all of them consciously. So the brain is very clever in just making shortcuts all the time and trying to make it as convenient and energy efficient as possible. And hence it just tries to use its non-conscious emotional part of the brain as much as possible. And that kind of data is very rarely captured by clients, although it determines the decision making and behavior 95% of the time. So that is something that clients and brands need to pay much more attention to and needs to start collecting this data because of its influence and importance on decision making. So on the next slide. So just to give you an idea again of what conscious and non-conscious actually means. So the conscious mind is basically when we make decisions based on reason, when we think things through, when we apply our logic and our willpower. However, as I said, 95% it is decisions that are influenced by our beliefs, by our emotions, by our habits, by our values, our past experiences, etc., etc. So that is what is mainly dominantly driving our decision making and behavior. And just to give you, you're on mute, Simon.
I was going to say, yeah, just to follow on, that it's interesting, isn't it, that it's quite shocking that even, scientists, consultants, biologists, engineers, kind of financial people all suffer from this. No one's excluded. And having worked in health, and I know there are some health people on who that extent probably work more in health than I have, you know, you learn very quickly that a lot of this stuff is very random, the decisions that you get given in terms of health treatment. So, you know, one thing I've learned is to try and be as healthy as long as possible, so I don't have to kind of deal with the non-conscious brains of the consultants that I might come across, because it's quite scary stuff that they might conclude.
Yeah, and that image just you know, shows very nicely our kind of irrational decision making, just to give you an idea. However, there are methods out there, and we do have methods that allows us to measure and to capture non-conscious data, and this is based on again on very profound psychological research done by Harvard, but also by Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winner in behavioral economics. And just to give you an idea of what kind of difference you get when you collect non-conscious data. So we've worked in this case with Virgin Holidays, and what they wanted us to find out is to understand how customers non-consciously perceive Virgin Holidays. So in this diagram, you can see a blue line, which represents non-conscious associations the customers had with Virgin Holidays, and then the red line, which are the conscious responses. So that's typically what you would get in surveys or any kind of data that you're collecting, big data. And you can see quite nicely here that there are huge discrepancies between what people say, so the conscious responses, versus how they really feel or how they really think about the brand. So these were all associations that Virgin Holidays wanted us to test with a little bit of research that we did qualitatively beforehand. And this gives really nice direction now to planners, to marketeers, to campaigners, etc., on where to bet on and what to go with for. So for example, there were high non-conscious associations between helpful, honest, inspiring, and Virgin Holidays. Which was really important for Virgin Holidays to be associated with. So this now told them, well, actually, we don't need to reiterate this further. We don't need to highlight this further, because on a non-conscious basis, we have already quite strong associations with that. However, for example, in the aspect of responsive, this was an important aspect as well to be associated with. However, as you can see, it is fairly low, even on a conscious level. And that then gave an indication, just as one example for Virgin Holidays, to say, well, this is an aspect we need to improve on. We need to improve on being associated with that. And that was one thing that they then went with in their campaigns and their CRM, etc. So it's possible to collect non-conscious data.
So what does this really mean in terms of mass disruption rather than destruction? We operate, as Katerina said, quite unconsciously when we're faced with a crisis. We display some negative emotions that can provide an added challenge for brands to kind of navigate. So from panic to anger to shock to confusion, in all these different states, we are definitely a bit more sensitive to messages, so that if a brand fails to pick up on it, they'll face quite a lot of scrutiny.
And I think, sorry to interrupt there, Francis, I think that what all of a sudden started to increase brands' awareness of considering emotions much more than they previously done, even though some brands did already a good job with that. But because now brands were faced with customers being predominantly in negative emotions, we saw many brands become completely paralyzed, and it's like, oh my God, how do we deal with these negative emotions? As Lauren said in the beginning, before brands were just basing on convenience, on product information, etc. But when the brain starts to experience predominantly negative emotions, what actually happens is it gets a tunnel view, and is just looking out for brands or anything that will allow to address these negative emotions and calm them down. And that is so key for brands to understand, especially when we talk about negative emotions, to respond accurately and to help customer brands to calm down their hugely negative emotions. And Francis will show which ones later.
To that note, all these emotions that you experience negatively, they're very complex. They're quite reactive, but most importantly, they're very human. This is where for brands is an opportunity to be more relatable. By humanizing your messaging, you get to kind of engage with customers in a more meaningful way. So what do we mean by disruptive change? And how does it affect brands? Well, it's about thinking about how you are more considerate in your communication. This has never been more important. The expectation of brands is a lot higher for consumers. If you put a foot wrong, it can lead to quite a severe backlash. So when we look at needs during a crisis, it's important that a brand tries to connect with where their customers are emotionally and actually address each emotion with a need. So how can you go from panic to clarity? How can you reassure your customers? How do you go from shock to delight? How can you give your customers a reason to smile? How do you go from confusion to certainty? How do you give your customers confidence that you'll always be there, or that they can access you at any time of the day? These are the things we have to start looking at when we are addressing particular emotions, especially negative ones. So when we think about rethinking our communication strategy, the first step is to actually think of an audience-first approach. We'll talk a bit more about this later. But what does this mean? Simply, it's about understanding what role you're playing in the everyday lives of your consumers.
So if we think about different roles and the different ways in which we can approach, effectively trying to do is understand where we want to sit amongst the role in both our lives as consumers, as we all are consumers, and how brands want to engage with their audience need states. And I think it's really important to note that you can't be everything to everyone. You can't try and sort of stretch yourself over every different type of role. We talked a little bit about this in the last session, whereby it's about kind of picking and choosing what you think is going to deliver the most amount of relevance. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do from a brand point of view is find what we classify as a human truth, something that we all intrinsically can relate to. Because the more we can relate to one another, the more we can sort of find that shared common ground, and that helps from an audience perspective, that helps from a messaging and a comms related perspective. It just allows us to be just that much, much more meaningful. Wanted to give you an example. I think this is probably my favorite example of all time when it comes to brands who have really got under the bonnet, understanding what it means to find a role and also to find a human truth that we can all relate to. It's Harvey Nichols. So we all know Harvey Nichols as a luxury retailer. Their brands that they house are usually very sort of high end, and your price point that you normally tend to sort of spend in Harvey Nichols will probably be a couple of £100 and up. So during a season of sort of major gift spending, which is obviously the Christmas season, Harvey Nichols had to find a slightly different angle as to how they communicate Christmas. And they understood categorically that when you come into a Harvey Nichols store, when you shop online, the reality is if you're going to spend, let's say, for example, £500, you're going to spend £500 on yourself. You're not going to spend it necessarily on all your loved ones. Maybe you are, maybe you're incredibly generous, but the reality is with luxury fashion, it's an indulgence. Therefore, I'm going to spend it on myself. So the way in which they approached the seasonal gifting question was that they created a Harvey Nichols universe of a gift collection. So every single time you bought something from Harvey Nichols, you would have the option to buy something for someone else, but the price point for the someone else was 99p or £1.70 or £1.80 on something that was branded by Harvey Nichols but completely mundane. And they created this world both in store, online, and through all their PR communications. So you'd have, for example, in their ad campaign, a grandpa being given his gift from Harvey Nichols. He'd open it up and he'd look a little bit confused because it was some toothpicks from Harvey Nichols, whereas you'd see the children wearing a fantastic outfit because they spent their Christmas money on themselves. And I think finding this really clever hook of something that is so unbelievably truthful allowed Harvey Nichols to play in a space that high-end fashion has struggled with massively over the last couple of years. They found an area that we can all relate to. If we're going to go into Harvey Nichols, we are going to spend good money on ourselves, not necessarily on everybody else. So I think just as an example, a principle of finding something that's incredibly human can make all the difference when it comes to your brand narratives and actually speaking to people in a way that they can get behind. because it's super powerful to find a message like this. They had a huge amount of uplift in sales. Their gift collection that was basically toothpicks, safety pins, sink plugs, gravel packaged were sold out within weeks. And again, that's just the power of finding something that's human. So what do we mean, or what can we do in terms of applying the same principles that we've been talking about from an audience need into actionable brand relevance? So we heard this term of audience first planning. We say it a lot. It's very easy to say, but what do we actually mean by it? Well, normally in the case of agencies or big companies, we focus on the process of pushing users down a purchasing funnel. It looks somewhat like this. It's incredibly linear. We try and understand people's interactions at every given stage and push them further down the purchasing funnel and even beyond. And that's how we tend to sort of see or try and sort of build our understanding of how a person or an individual or a group of people engage with us as a brand. We also sometimes add to that mix understanding who we target via multiple data points. Now, this could be in relation to dynamic activities such as weather or season, location, your past history. So again, that historic data point, anything to do with the channels that you engage with, all the way through to your dropout rate in a purchase process. Again, this is very categorized and very sort of linear in the way in which it understands how a person feels. It's really working on understanding the points of which they interact. And on top of that, we also like to add this layer of social listening, which again, for those who sort of have delved into the big bad world of social advertising, this is sort of looking at community management, looking at what people are engaging with brands from a communications point of view, all the way through to what they're talking about in their groups. Again, to reiterate, this is categorizing people in such an extent that we are looking purely and utterly at their behavioral patterns or their interaction patterns, which is very synonymous with the agency or the ad world that we live in. But again, like all of these points, there is something fundamentally missing from this process, because these are all data-centric pieces of information.
And that is, again, how to answer the question why. It is the understanding the human truth and what actually drives our decision making, what actually drives our behavior is what is meaningful to us. We evaluate everything that we do, that we engage with, that we buy, is all on the basis of what does this mean to me? What does this give me? Not in terms of I save money or this looks shiny, etc. But what does this really mean to me? And we can segment an audience and evaluate an audience based on their underlying psychological needs or the meaning for them and what the brand means to them. So what we mean by that is, for example, does your brand or does your product and services allow them to gain something on a need state? Is it power, for example? Do they get a sense and emotion of belonging, or does it allow them to be respected when they buy into your brand or present themselves with your brand? Or is it something that they're using you because they don't want to lose something and you allow them not to lose? So not to lose face, not to lose safety, not to lose time, or to be included and not to be excluded from the group. That is on a non-conscious level how we evaluate anything we engage with. And does the brand allow me to do this? Or is it suggesting new opportunities for me? Am I gaining something, a development opportunity, or I can discover something about myself that I can talk to about, or I feel pride or proud about certain things that the brand is giving me? When we have understood what the meaning is for customers of the brands, that's truly when we have understood an audience driving decision-making and behavior. And all the other data points, there's a lot of distraction with that. And the beauty about psychological needs are that it doesn't matter if you work across the globe with Japanese clients, South American clients, European clients, American clients, we all share about 10 to 12 universal needs, which means we are all driven and we all hold these universal needs. The only difference is that some of us give more importance to some of these needs than others. So for example, some customers might be more driven by a need for self-direction. So this is all about looking for the opportunities, how can I develop myself, etc. That's really strong in them, and that determines their decisions and for what brand they go for, what service they go for, what product they go for, etc. However, others might be more driven by tradition, for example, which is really important to them. They don't want to be excluded from the group. They want to keep the way things have worked, etc. So they are less open to these opportunities. And some people might be all about security. They have a very high need for control. They want to make sure that they're on top of things and get the details, etc. So we tend to segment an audience based on these psychological needs because they are ultimately the fundament of behavior and driving behavior. And then everything else falls on that. So cultural aspects just basically is an expression of these underlying needs. So it might be expressed differently in Japan, but the underlying need is the same. And we just need to understand Japanese, for example, communications and making sure we use the right word.
So how we tend to utilize this process to combine those two areas of data and emotion, which then gives us a much better picture as to how we can go around our comms processes. We have developed with Innovation Bubble together a setup that almost gives us 4 stages to going live with any kind of communication. So in the case of audience planning and audience understanding, we sort of look at this from the exploration and development part of our process. So we normally start with our working sessions together with the brands, where we join the dots between the comms and industry landscape. And this is really to get everybody on the same page as what direction we're heading in. Following from that, we then look at exploration, which is that research and review, looking at the landscape and looking at the audience need states in line with a digital review, not separated from it. It needs to be part and parcel of the same world. From here, we look at comms development and validation. Again, this is when we start to be a little bit more creative and start testing thoughts, considerations, concepts at the very early stage of communication. So again, we're not going ahead and producing something without validating it as much as possible up front. So that spider diagram that we showed you at the very beginning, understanding what the brand tends to normally feel or think people are feeling versus what they're actually subconsciously feeling. We can validate all creative work in this development phase before producing it or hitting the ground running and producing something that's really been thought through up front. And to that point, for us, as we talked about last time, the validation up front, not after launch, is so important, because what we're trying to do is limit or reduce the amount of time we go through iterations of things that dilutes messaging, dilutes purpose post-launch. We want to try and ensure that we are doing the best or producing the best possible outcome early on within the development process that we deliver together.
I think the other thing to add to that, Frances, is that first impressions are also really important. So the thing with validating up front is you minimize the negative first impressions you might do after launch and trial and error. And of course, we all know once you create a first impression, as you know, with people you meet, it's very hard for you to shift it. So, you know, there are lots of risks involved with not validating up front. And it's kind of mind-blowing how many brands just kind of put stuff out and then iterate on the cuff of the kind of launch. Yeah. And then not realize why things won't shift. And it's because they've created a bad first impression.
We found that when brands, even though we know with media you will be testing and tweaking things as you go along once things have launched, sometimes we tend to find that brands dilute the message so much they've lost track of where they started. So again, to find that balancing act and really understand what you're doing at the very beginning phase of development is so important. It reduces time, risk, and budget, all the things that we want to try and avoid sort of hitting our heads against a brick wall when you've got something live.
To give you an example of a client of ours that understood this, and before they launched a huge campaign, and some of you who live in London might have seen that ad as well, some might have seen it on TV, was they wanted to understand what is it that makes an insurance brand trustworthy, especially Aviva Insurance. And we digged into this and tried to understand what is it about trust and insurance and that relationship between customers and Aviva Insurance especially. So we did qualitative research here with psychologists, digging really deep and having very deep conversations with customers. And what we maybe not surprisingly found was that many customers had actually a huge issue with how they were treated by insurance brands. So, and very often you're calling up and you want to maybe sign up for an insurance, and you are asked questions and questions, for example, home insurance, about your locks and things about your house that you have no clue about whatsoever. And you feel extremely intimidated, or you want to make a claim and your insurer is just interrogating and treating you like a criminal. So once Aviva Insurance truly understood how customers actually feel about and what these emotional barriers are to trust Aviva Insurance, they turned this into a very literal one-to-one campaign, and reflected that emotion and reflected that they understood now how customers feel about signing up or dealing with insurance. And you might have seen that campaign Get a Quote, Not a Quiz, or the Inquisition short YouTube ad campaign, I think that was also on TV, where they literally represented, we just want to give you a quote and not quiz you to death. And it also had implications in terms of business changes internally to really reflect that and not just talk about it, but actually do something about it. And that was very successful afterwards.
Another example of a brand that we worked on was obviously Hyatt Hotels, and they came at a time to us to speak to us about a seasonal campaign. It was just before Christmas. I think they approached us in October. And obviously Christmas ads and media is going out heavily, all guns blazing, 3 months before Christmas time. But they had decided that they wanted to promote room availability over a seasonal period across 5 key markets. Now, anyone who thinks logically about Christmas time and travel is that when you are thinking about Christmas, you're traveling home, not necessarily abroad. Now, it's not to say that some people don't go and explore and they're a little bit more intrepid when it comes to Christmas travel, but the majority of people, when they're thinking about Christmas, they're thinking about either being home or going home, being with family and friends, not necessarily going to do anything beyond that. So we had to find effectively a human, or appeal to a human truth about speaking to Hyatt or potential Hyatt customers in a different way, rather than just promoting a offer, because again, media spends were really, really high at that period of time. Everyone's selling their mothers the kitchen sink and everything to everyone. There's deals everywhere. It's just before the main sales period. So we had to find a slightly different way of talking to people who weren't thinking about travel. So we had 5 markets. So we thought, okay, we've got 1 month, again, doing this in a really quick turnaround, 1 month to put together a campaign that can speak to these 5 markets. So 5 markets, 5 themes, 5 stories that acted as a seasonal trailer or a web series, all told from the perspective of people who live in those markets. Nothing to do with travelers, nothing to do with necessarily travel or tourism, but people who genuinely lived in these 5 places. It was obviously supported by media targeting across channels, but it acted a little bit like, I don't know if anyone's seen Chef's Table on Netflix, where there's obviously these sort of narratives around chefs, but it's not about the food, it's about the person and about the individual. So this took a lot of this sort of inspiration from how this was produced. And we came up with a web series that tapped into different senses across these 5 markets. And each market was attributed to a sense that it felt it was synonymous with. So for example, Shanghai was one of our markets, and we decided to do a whole thing around the taste of Shanghai. Sight was Dubai, because it's really, it's a visual, a highly visual place to be. We chose sound for London, obviously being a heavy bustling city, not on lockdown, obviously. We chose smell for Paris because of the sort of perfumery culture, the bakery culture, and the sort of slightly more kind of lifestyle route to the city. And we chose touch for Tokyo. So we talked around from a textile and a sort of texture point of view. And we found a travel photographer and filmmaker who we sent on a 20-day round trip across these locations to meet with someone who lived there and could show them the sensory experience of each city. And over a course of 1 month, we created an entire web series that then helped retarget the premise around places that you can explore, which was the brand's campaign name. And we saw that people were booking immediately in those markets because it was something different. It was a different perspective, and every single series started and ended with the hotel, but the core of it was really about the people and the experience that that Hyatt could help deliver in terms of that seasonal period. So it was a slightly different way to bypass the angle of promotion, everything at the same time, and to do something was a little bit more meaningful and the human truth. So
and I think
to kind of finalize what we've been talking about this afternoon is that, sorry, I interrupted Catherine.
No, I think the connection is a little bit, what I want to say is if you check it out online, it's really great ads, but you can see it is hardly talked about Hyatt. Like Hyatt just shows up in these videos at the end or maybe in the beginning, and that's it. And it's not about promoting hotel rooms and how great the lobby is and the wellness area, etc. What so many brands are doing. It's not about that at all.
Or the price.
Or the price, exactly. I think there was a subline on the end of a video with a URL, and that was pretty much it. The rest of it was all about the place, because effectively you travel somewhere, you go and see the place, you don't necessarily live in the hotel. So again, it was trying to find another way to talk about it in a slightly more meaningful perspective. So just to kind of finalize, the sort of 4 things that we identified with talking to you about audience needs states is: 1, we need to appeal to what people really feel versus what we want them to feel. I think it's really easy for us as brands or as business owners to start trying to kind of force feed a message people's throats. We have to start appealing to what people actually feel, what they're going through right now is super, super important. We have to understand that we have to combine data and emotional patterns. We cannot rely solely on the data, because what we've seen to date will be fundamentally different tomorrow. And that's the kind of the beauty, and again, the blessing, the curse of digital media, is that what we see today will be different tomorrow. So we have to be able to combine emotional patterns with data as much as we possibly can, because that helps in turn for us understand what's meaningful to customers, what they really, really want, what they need from us as marketers. And then that helps us in turn understand or identify customers' driving is that influence behavior and decision-making. We talked about this before. Again, trying to push someone into a category based on data doesn't tell you everything about them and what they're doing and why they're doing it. It doesn't answer that why question that Simon mentioned at the beginning. It only answers, or gives you an idea of potential patterns of their interaction behavior. So again, being a bit more detailed about how we look at customers' behavior and decision making is really, really going to be important to how we manage and create narratives that work better and harder for us as brands. So hopefully that's given you a little bit of a taste as to what we could start to be thinking about, what you could be thinking about over the coming months.
And in terms of numbers, you're talking about, and we checked these are not our numbers, these are the client numbers. I mean, you're talking, if you do this, you're talking things like 50% increase in sales. 30% increase in cross sale, 25% reduction in churn. It's really quite kind of interesting, the numbers that we're getting back from the clients we're working with in terms of the impact this is having on their kind of engagement with customers. So it's not a case that, oh, this sounds nice. It's actually fundamentally making changes, and big changes, in terms of that audience kind of perspective.
Exactly. Does anyone have any questions? Either you can drop a note in the chat function, or if you want to unmute yourself and just ask directly, we can have a chat about it, or maybe everything's been super, super clear and you want to just go ahead and sort of hit the ground running.
Hi, are there just wondering if there's any examples of brands that you think are doing a great job now at sort of pivoting to addressing change state of emotion? So, the examples you've given are sort of pre-crisis. Are there any examples of what you see brands doing now that you think is good?
We had an example in a previous deck that actually we talked about before. I think it was Frank. It was Burger King, wasn't it? That did a really clever approach to dealing with people's sort of emotions and not being able to access a brand like Burger King, for example. I know it's a completely different industry to the ones that we've talked about during this presentation, but they realized that when everyone went into lockdown, no one could access their services, their product. So instead of trying to force feed, proverbial statement of saying force feed Burger King down people's throats, is that they gave people the option to recreate their favorite products from Burger King through sort of targeted media, but in a way that was sort of helping them sort of learn how to do it themselves. And as they saw people's interactions with them sort of start to grow back, because again, what we have to remember is that when the world went into shutdown, marketing and advertising also went into its own version of shutdown. So you had to kind of rebuild trust, rebuild engagement with people in a different way. And Burger King did this quite well. And as they started to regain sort of interactions with people by giving them sort of other solutions to recreate the Whopper burger or whatever at home, they're able to create things on the go or on the fly with consumers through social. And that's an interesting way to keep people interested in a brand, even though they couldn't actually service them with a physical product. That's one example of a brand that was quite interesting, or reacted very quickly to what was going on in the industry at that period of time.
There's also a bank that's doing mortgages in terms of mortgage holidays, and we worked out with them quite quickly that it's quite, some people are quite embarrassed, although they need it. It's quite highly charged to actually ask for a mortgage loan, because in terms of other people in the household, it might be a signal of failure. And so some people are not actually under the sort of general, we might be open to a mortgage holiday if you apply for it. This excludes some people because they feel that if they do that, then they put their head above the parapet for everyone to turn around and say, oh my goodness, you didn't tell me we were doing that badly that we now need a mortgage kind of holiday. And that might not be the case. And so that threatens their kind of status, their self-esteem, their sense of achievement. And so what the actual bank's been doing is actually doing more of a one-to-one with people they think possibly might kind of want a mortgage holiday, and kind of take that offline, and so make it sort of personable to the person to say, look, we're not going to make this known. We don't have to talk to you at certain times. We can talk to you at 9 o'clock tonight if it means that you're going to be alone in a room and no one's going to be hearing it. So it's that very kind of individual look, but it's based on the needs of the emotions around failure and embarrassment and challenge to my status. And that's actually, they said they've managed to sort of double the number of people they put on this mortgage holiday, and the number of kind of letters and emails of gratitude they've had about how did you know that I needed it, but I couldn't ask for it in my presence, was remarkable. And that, for them, they've created customers for life now, because these people are going to be like, you enabled me to do this without any embarrassment. Thank you very much. You've got me now because I know that you know me.
We have two more questions on the chat. So question number one is, we talked about what's really meaningful to customers. Where's a good place to start when trying to understand what's meaningful to them, as opposed to what we assume is meaningful to them? Yeah, really good question. So I think one of the big things that big data kind of overshadowed was actually some really good psychological qualitative research. I think there's no way, even in the future, around actually talking to customers. And again, it is about tapping into this non-conscious. It is about asking the right questions. We give you an example. When we worked with a frozen yogurt brand, and we were literally observing as well how customers were purchasing frozen yogurt and what it meant to them. And it was not about health and low calories, etc., but it was actually, they were purchasing frozen yogurt as an accessory. And it was important to them what kind of colors were matching their styles, and that they were perceived with, what great combination they put on the frozen yogurt. That was meaningful to them. That's why you now see frozen yogurt and cupcakes at Topshop. because customers shopped frozen yogurt as accessories. So it's so fundamental, not just to look at big data, not just to do social listening on social media, because how many masks are people wearing on social media, and how reliable is that data, what people are actually telling on these channels? We need to talk to customers, and we need to ask the right questions. That for a start. So don't get rid of qualitative. You're on mute, Simon.
I was going to say, things like surveys won't do that necessarily, because you're asking people a question and you're defining the parameters that they can talk about. So, you know, you've just defined the playing field, and it may be that what's interesting to them or meaningful to them is in the playing stands or is in the restaurant. It's not even actually on the playing field. So that's a problem in itself. The other question that we had was about how do we assess the non-conscious, and we have a number, given that we're psychologists, which is always an advantage. We do this from a quantitative point of view. So we've worked with our neuropsychologists and our psychometric team to develop an online test that works globally. That's very good at segmenting your audiences down into what they need. So, you know, whether it's control, whether it's kind of ego management, whether it's opportunity. And what we find is that it actually reduces your audience down into very finite groups. You're not talking 12, 16 segments, which is awful for any comms person to deal with. I think the most we've seen is 3 or 4, which makes it much more manageable. So, for example, we did this for Ted Baker in the UK and in America. We looked at all their audiences. They had something like 12 segments, they thought. We actually found they had 3 psychologically. And to cut a long story short, as a consequence of finding those 3, we worked through all their product placements in store and online. And they reported that actually they had a 23% increase in sales in the US as a result of what we found from that segmentation, and a 50% increase in the UK. I mean, these are pretty big numbers in change. And all we simply did was we understood what it is that the audience needs to hear and how you place the product in front of them. And this works in holidays, it works in health, pharma. We work a lot in pharma. How you place the drugs in terms of what the HCP or the patient needs to hear or is important to their life, whether it's investment, banking, makes no difference. It's how you frame it and package it in terms of meeting those underlying needs.
I think there was actually a really interesting example to your point around what's meaningful and how you apply that information in a way that is super easy for people to kind of just get on board with. Is an example that kind of springs to mind of a project we did a while ago with Ernest Jones, actually, to that point, exactly to what you mentioned in terms of finding something that's not necessarily sort of obvious to us as marketeers, is that they had an issue with one page on their website. And again, we go back to that mix between the emotion information and the data information, is that they didn't understand why this one page, which was the ring sizer page. Now you'd think for Ernest Jones as a brand who sell engagement rings, wedding rings and jewelry, that they would understand how people interact and how people shopped in terms of the process of choosing something and then going through to purchase. But they had a real misunderstanding as to how, for example, men choose or decide to go about choosing the engagement ring for their other half. And they had created a system for themselves whereby it was fully and utterly fixated on women, because their assumptions were women like jewelry, therefore they buy it. But at the end of the day, if it's an engagement ring process, it's going to be the guy buying the engagement ring. So we had a system where we had to kind of go back, tell them to go a little bit further back through the purchase experience journey, with men at the core of their consideration process, because it's the man who buys the ring. So rather than creating a narrative or a message for women about engagement rings, we created one for a man, whereby we created a digital ring sizer for men to surreptitiously take their other half's piece of jewelry and measure on their mobile phones their ring size they could purchase directly off the website, which then it reduced bounce rate, reduced issues between purchase and experience. And we saw an uplift in 60% increase on time on site for people actually gaining or buying their engagement rings. But so it wasn't looking at the data from a front-facing value, it was looking at how the message did not appeal to the person that was effectively utilizing the service. So we had to kind of re-engineer a little bit how they operated, and then really, really simply just put it in practice. And they saw that that became a really key area of how they engage with men as an audience versus women. So not knowing how to do this is sometimes a little bit daunting, but it can be made really, really simplified.
We've had one last question from Jim, which is actually, you could do a whole series on this, Jim.
Yeah,
But it's a really interesting question. It's like, AI and automation, and how does that play out in customer experience? To cut a long story short, we're humans, and our brains are designed to interact with other humans. So we're quite distrustful of automated systems. So although they're useful, we don't necessarily trust them. So let me take an example. When people feel ill, they probably trawl online to look at their symptoms and spend all sorts of time and effort looking about what I might have, and then go into kind of panic when they kind of get these descriptions that they're about to die tomorrow. But they still don't trust these kind of analysis. They still want to book an appointment with a GP because they want to look into the eye of their GP to see, actually, do I trust what this person's saying to me? And that's what you don't get with automation AI. You don't get to look in anyone's eye. And unfortunately, the way our brains are designed is to look into eyes. The non-verbal stuff is far more important about the semantics. And so, in answer to your question, what we need to do is, back to Katerina and Francis's point, and Lauren, is you need to work out what is it that someone needs. And if you can work out what they need, you can then actually, I suppose, encase a conversational style in your chatbot. Because if it's about control, and the person is about, I need control back in my life, I don't want you as a brand to take control from me, but I need you to give me a sense of control, then you can see how the conversation might flow about how you give the illusion that the person could have control. Or whether it's about social inclusion, how do you give them the impression that by doing what they're doing, they're still going to kind of keep the integrity of their kind of group inclusion in place. So it's about the content, but in order for you to do that, you need to know kind of what is the need of the person I'm talking to. And that's not hard to do. And we've done this all over the place. So we've used pictures on investment banking sites to work out who's landing on that. Depending on what picture they're clicking, we roughly know what drives them. And so from that, we then know how to talk to them. And that's driven sales by kind of, increasing numbers as well. But that's the crux of it. I think they are useful, as you say. But what we need to do is more of the homework about what is it that the person needs for us to be able to look at what the language and the conversational framework we use in these kind of automated processes.
Yeah, and that,
we can do a whole week on this.
Yeah, and that needs to become the fundament of almost for AI as well. It's and the danger is that AI is currently based, again, just on the functional aspects. It's based on how the majority of people are perceiving humans. And yeah, it won't work. It will go in the absolute wrong direction.
It's also on the flip side to AI, you've got programmatic media, which also tends to sit in the same vein as AI, where you, again, I think the amount of times we've been told we need to create dynamic ads or with a dynamic messaging for very functional related topics. Again, you're not really appealing to someone's need, you're just appealing to a piece of data. Again, it goes very much back into just data collection versus actually anything human.
We have one last question, which builds on the question around the non-conscious. Question is, are there a certain set of emotions you would advise all brands test, or would you say it varies from brand to brand, and what associations they should measure? I would say it varies from brand to brand. So we need to understand what and that would be Duo's work. What does your brand stand for? Why? What are your values, etc. Based on that, we would take these associations and test them. But part of the package is definitely always testing emotional reactions. How do people feel around your brand, around your category, around your competitors? If you are an existing brand in the market, how they currently feel about it. But there's no set of emotions that would be based on your tailored brand. Okay. Lauren, do you want to?
Yep. So any other questions, or we're good? Okay. So just to kind of sort of end on that note, based on the kind of questions you might be having or the things that you might be thinking about, if you're feeling at any point that some of these sort of speak to any of your needs at the moment, we can definitely work out what we kind of call the first instance of brand therapy, as it were, a 20-minute conversation to have an understanding in terms of what you're thinking, what the issues are, where you've had maybe some pain points, and think about how that maybe can be reapplied into sort of an actual next step. And what we are doing at the moment, specifically within this lockdown period, because this is kind of how we've had to readdress how we work, is offering sort of bespoke workshops to address those brand issues that can be done relatively quickly, and to start giving you a direction of where to apply next steps for your comms, whether it's from an audience point of view, whether it's from a narrative point of view, or anything else other. So if you fancy, or you're thinking that's something that might help, do feel free to get in touch. Next week, we will be talking about brand narratives and applying the audience needs into actual narratives and how that comes to life. So join us the same time, same place, same link on Thursday, 4th of June. We'll send out a reminder to everyone who joined this one, just with information for next as well. But if you do fancy getting in touch with us, drop us an email, and together between Innovation Bubble and Duo Creative Media, we'll get back to you with a way in which we can chat and have a coffee over Zoom and see what the issues are and see how we can help. So thank you very much for joining us and for asking all your lovely questions, and we'll speak to you hopefully next week.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.